So if I look at the data collection tools itself, one of the most common ones that I've heard of is the sample survey.
Yeah.
That seems to be the most common or the easy go-to that people
Yeah.
have. In fact, for the Raahi video podcast, I recently released a feedback survey, and that was actually looking at exactly that, right? So what would be some tips and tricks or things to keep in mind while selecting the sample, etc., etc.?
I'm going to be very frustrating and give you the answer that it does
Depends.
depends. But a few things to keep in mind are, going back to your question. Is my question asking how many people are behaving in a certain way in which I want to get as accurate as possible? Then I would want to have a larger sample size. What does that mean? I also rethink my tools.
Right.
A larger sample size is much easier to do with a survey. Does that help me answer my question? As a rule, typically statistically, people say you need a minimum of 30 to make any meaning, but that's again without context. I don't know how much 30 out of how many. Right? So people who come and ask, is 6% enough? Is 7% enough? Is 8% enough? Is 25% enough? There is really no way to give you a particular specific answer on that. It depends on your universe. How many people are you actually working with? To what point do you want to be not 100%, but how close to reality do you need to get?
Model.
Right? Do you need direction or do you need full accuracy here? Right. I think your sample size is determined by that. Your sample size is also determined by your tool. Now, let's say for a survey, I may want to get as big a sample as possible. But typically for interviews or other qualitative tools, the benchmark is, the more I'm doing, if I'm hearing the same themes come up again and again and again, that is a good indication for you to stop, because you're not generating new insights.
Right.
Or that's an indication for you to think about, have I sampled the people well enough? Am I getting diverse perspectives? So when people are talking about sampling, I would also urge them to pay enough attention to sampling methodologies and not just sample size. By that, I mean, do I randomly pick? If I have 50 people in front of me, am I pulling things out of a chit?
Right.
Or do I say, among this 50 people, I know that there is a lot of diversity in this group. So do I divide them into different genders and I pick out of those genders? Do I look at perspectives of different social groups? Right? So it depends on
tenure and role.
Tenure and role. So do I want to do stratified sampling? So all of that matters as much, and I'm going to stick my head out a little bit and say more than how many people you sample.
Fair enough. So, and one question that I have to ask you, are randomized control trials the gold standard, and should I always be looking to do one?
Are they the gold standard for evaluation? In my opinion, yes.
Okay.
But does that mean every single person in every single context must do it? Not at all.
Okay.
The reality is RCTs are extremely expensive. They serve a particular purpose. If I really want to understand if my intervention and my intervention alone has a lasting attribution towards a particular impact, RCTs are probably the best way to collect this. Which is why I think even when you hear JPAL and different members speak about it, they do speak about RCTs at a certain level, at a certain scale. It is a really good policy evaluation tool. Personally, I don't think every single organization at all stages of their life journey need to only think of randomized control trials. There are other rigorous methods that you can follow that are equally sort of helpful in answering the questions that you might have at that point in time. I'm also going to share something that's not very popular, but another thing I feel is that we, in the social sector, lot of factors come together to impact, right? And I don't know whether we always need to find out sole attribution. And if that is a question for the organization to determine, how important is it for me at this stage of my organization or for my program to actually understand whether I need attribution data? And I think that answer to that question should determine whether you choose to invest in this, because it's a very, very expensive process. There is a lot of rigor, which is what makes it the gold standard. Every single person involved in the process is trained to the T, and it justifies many of those costs. But is this a cost to undertake? For what purpose?
Right.
I think you should ask yourself that question and then go depending on the answer that you're getting.
I feel like sometimes it's unclear whether the data I'm collecting is for MEL or is it actually for for actually fundraising, because you are also telling something, a positive story, right? So if I get testimonials from my beneficiaries, does that count as an MEL tool or a program tool?
In my opinion, I don't think there should be any difference there.
Right.
The reason I say this is because if you start differentiating and collecting different data for different people, it becomes tricky.
Yeah.
I think it is a different thing to say, in my universe, all of what I'm collecting is helping us learn for the program. A subset of this is helpful for external reporting.
Nice. I really like that framing.
So ideally, and I know it's not always possible, ideally you collect what you need to collect for your program, and from there you say, what can I actually share? And by that, I don't mean just positive things. I just mean what is helpful at the topmost level for another person who's not involved in my day-to-day to actually learn about this. So I actually think testimonials should be about for the program and for MEL. It should be about what can I learn from this. It's also a source of learning and data.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And one thing I would add is, you don't know what, especially when you look at reporting and when you look at external, taking pieces from the puzzle and sharing externally. I remember an incident where I was presenting the data that we had of a program at scale. I was presenting to a potential funder and I was showing them the graphs that we had made, right? I was showing them all sorts of really complex, fine, intricate detail that we had. No reaction. They were not getting it. They were like, but what are you really doing? And then finally, we played a testimonial of one of the beneficiaries. And then another one. And they were on the edge of their seat and they're like, wow, this is phenomenal. You guys are doing such great work. So you don't really know what is useful. So I love what you said around getting the data to learn about the program and keeping it with you and selecting what would make sense for any external context and sharing that for reporting. There is a certain dynamic that happens between the monitoring and evaluation team, the program team, and let's say the broader leadership which is not involved in the nitty-gritties and the fundraising team. So it's in this matrix, right, where everyone has different needs and incentives that MEL is operating in. So I was just curious to know, how do you manage that dynamic? Do you stay isolated? Is there a fear of collusion and co-option? So
there is always a fear of collusion, but again, I think this is where working with, as a practitioner, monitoring, evaluation and learning professional differs from me working at an academic institution.
Right.
The fact that I'm working as a practitioner means I do need to understand, and there is a difference between understanding and fully being involved. I do need to fully be involved in the program design stage because I need to know what impact we want to have. I need to make sure that we are measuring the right things. I do need to understand what the program is for and how it's being implemented so that the insight we generate out of it is actually meaningful and we involve the program team as much. I do think there is a need for a little bit of objectivity in terms of what the results are.
Right.
You do have to play the role of the person who speaks truth to power.
Right.
And I'm not saying that the other verticals do not do that. But I think here the responsibility is more because the person has a little bit of privilege of being away, right? And it's actually easier for that person to play that role versus someone who's been on the ground every single day and who's like, I'm seeing change, your data is not capturing it. And I think that's a very valid sentiment and perspective. And that also probably means, please look at your tools. If the data is not capturing it, look at
your metrics. Because I think it did happen in our case also, where I remember when we were working together, there was conversation that was coming from the program team that mindset shift matters. That the work that we're doing at scale, a lot of it is also around the mindset shift of people in power and leadership positions. Interestingly, a couple of years down, we fundamentally rewired the MEL framework to also look at both the impact on, say, the child and the teacher, and on the system in terms of shifting mindset. So do not ignore the gut feeling, the intuition, the simple speak that might be coming from the program teams. Your role as MEL would probably be to fit that within your frame so it all makes sense together, right?
I think so. And I think there's also an equation with fundraising, right? And I think, again, there is this sense to make the fundraising function a little bit of a villain, because you're asking for things that, oh, you're constantly asking us to report. But that's also coming from maybe a place of not having full visibility. It's coming from a place of pressure. I mean, I can't even imagine it, to be honest, to constantly be under that kind of pressure. So it also means constantly working and learning from that person, but also sharing back what that effort actually looks like, what it means, and not just for the team, but also for who we are working for, right? So I think the dynamic does differ. I would also think that the dynamic changes as your organization becomes more mature. Right? Maybe then you can take a little bit more of a step back sometimes and then think of zooming out and seeing how you can contribute back to the sector. So I think the dynamic has to change as the organization grows a bit more. And I do think that there is added responsibility on the MEL person to play the role of, I'm going to definitely make sure that I'm involving myself in different parts of this conversation and making sense, putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
And that is a lot of pressure. So I've seen the journey of an organization where it had a no MEL person, single MEL person, 2 MEL people, and it grew to about 10 people working in specialized ways in different cuts, right? So don't necessarily look at it as you must have all the skills yourself. But more and more, as things get more complex and things get more sophisticated, there is often going to be a team that plays on complementary skills that come together to do everything that Poorvaja just mentioned. I have also heard of organizations where they have a split between the data analysis, data analysts, and the insight generators, essentially, right? So those are the 2 separate functions built within the team. Don't have a point of view on which one is more effective, etc. That's a lot more complex as a question, but just thought I'd call that out. So coming to, if I take the lens of an MEL professional who's watching this, let's talk a little bit about careers and how to help them, because that were some of the questions that came. So question number 1, what skills do I need as an MEL professional?
I'm going to try and articulate this in a few groups because I think there's a mix. And I also want to put out there that I don't think everyone will always have all the technical skills in terms of all statistical knowledge, and I certainly don't, and I think that's okay. But I think a few broad skills that are necessary. One, an ability to draw connections and to see how pieces of the puzzle fit together. And I think this becomes especially critical when you think of defining impact, thinking about the theory of change. It's really actually trying to form connections of how impact is going to be made, right? So I think that's a big skill set. So whether you call that critical thinking, analytical thinking, problem solving, I think all of that kind of gets grouped together. I definitely think there are certain core technical skills, and I think it definitely helps to have an understanding of survey design, understanding of tool design, understanding of evaluation methods, of data analysis, which is the most common one. And I think it's also, when you are building an MEL team, I think it's also to have an outlook that you may not always get all of this in one person, but it's important for your team to have that mix, and for that professional to also grow expertise along the way. So I think the second is like a huge set of technical skills. The third, although people speak about MEL as a sector agnostic role, I think it really does help for you to have deep knowledge in the sector you're working in at that point in time. Now, there is a school of thought that MEL is a sector agnostic role. And I think there's some truth to that, like someone must or should be able to move across. But while you are in that organization, I think it's very beneficial to build that kind of knowledge, because you can actually then ask the critical questions, if not have all the answers.
Right.
I really felt like my biggest contribution within this whole space was when I'm helping define impact, I'm also doing research on what that looks like in different spaces.
Right.
And that requires, if not full knowledge and interest in the sector, right? Similarly, while we are making meaning, asking the right questions of what the data is telling us. So I think that's an important skill set. Finally, I would think of communications and stakeholder management. The latter are skills I realized much later in my career, and it's exactly for the dynamics that you spoke about. And I would think this is actually a common skill across the roles in this space. But communication, right, which is, I'm learning all of this. How do I communicate this in a simple, user-friendly manner to people who are not necessarily in my context or do not necessarily fully get into the details in terms of jargon speak. So I would think these are 4 groups of skills.
And hearing these, I can understand why more and more MEL and strategy are
Yeah.
merging. Because these are the exact skill sets you need in any strategic role.
Yeah.
And I've been hearing someone who we both know, a very seasoned MEL professional. She was laughing, saying that, yeah, I seem to have become a strategy person now. Suddenly, I'm being invited for strategy meetings. So, and second question on the career aspect, what are some resources that you would recommend for someone who's looking to understand this space better?
I think there is a particular source of information called Beta Eval. It's a website. There are lots of really helpful frameworks, tools, templates that you can dig into. I think that's helpful as you're just like, going along. I do think that there is a lot of resources around like conferences that have come up in this space and professional development courses. So I would definitely recommend that. For those who are studying, right, like for those who are pursuing masters in the development sector space, I highly recommend taking a course, not necessarily on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, but something around measurement, something around data, something around frameworks.
Right.
And I think that those are really helpful, because I've seen a lot of people finish grad school and then they're like, oh, I wish I could have taken that particular course here. And I'm not even talking about the fact that it's employable. Right? Like even beyond that, I think we spoke about how a lot of program people are also looking at MEL as a core skill for them. I think even in that context, I think that's helpful. And I think that the sector itself is a huge resource, right? So don't be in isolation. Talk to other MEL professionals in the field and learn insights and share insights with them. I think this is one sector where I don't think any one person is the expert. I don't think anyone has all the answers. So I think the peer community becomes extremely critical.
That's a useful resource, absolutely. I think especially post-COVID, there's been a proliferation of communities and more interaction, at least more visibly, between organizations at all levels and interest groups being formed. And finally, what would be 3 do's and 1 don't that you would share?
Okay, this is where I need to put on the Gyan hat. I'd say number 1, think about the what before the how. And by this, I mean, think about what impact you want to have before you jump into how am I going to measure and collect this data. Number 2, do not think of MEL as an afterthought. Think of it as something that you start at the core of your program, because otherwise it's not just a skill, it's also habit, it's also culture. Right? Generating that culture later becomes much more trickier. And a lot of the things we spoke about in terms of the tensions, in terms of the conflict between functions, I think comes because we think of this as oh, I need to report on this now. And then it kind of becomes a trigger point. Right. So that would be like, think of MEL right from the start of doing something. Number 3, and this is more for organizations, look at building an MEL team. Because like we said, these are skill sets. I think it's humanly impossible for one person to encapsulate all of these, right? Look at a team and look at a mix of your team. In terms of the don't, do not think of MEL as reporting or data. And I think we've spoken enough about why that is the case. Even if that is your trigger point for why you need this function, do not let that just remain a trigger and the reason alone. Do think of it as a learning function. There is also a lot of research and speak about like a learning organization, like Peter Senge. A lot of people have spoken about systems thinking, learning organization. And I think if you claim to be a learning organization, I do not understand how you can do that without MEL being the center of this learning system. So yeah.
And now this is a term that I have to use in the interview. What is the impact that AI is going to have on MEL?
I think this is going to be hard to give a definitive answer. We can already see a lot of professionals using AI for analysis, right? Especially around I'm collecting all this qualitative information. How do I summarize my learnings from this? Obviously, ChatGPT does this in 5 minutes versus you spending hours on this. So it's already being used very significantly. I also know of organizations using it to define impact, find indicators, reducing your research time that you are doing. What implications I think this will have is that it will add an element of complexity in terms of skill.
Right.
It is also a skill to know what to use from ChatGPT and AI. Because as we've seen externally, ChatGPT AI is prone to error. Right? And it's not just discerning error, it's also making sense of it. It's synthesizing.
Prompting in the right way.
Exactly.
Providing the right inputs from our end.
Exactly. And ideally, asking the right question should be a skill anyway that you have. I think it just becomes more crucial over here. It will, I think, improve efficiency. I do have questions around equity. Just as all of us have questions around AI and its impact and whether it'll have differentiated impact on different communities. What does this mean for organizations with a lot more resources and organizations with not as many resources? And I don't have the answers, but I am concerned about
how this
how
will play out.
Yeah.
And to be honest, there are times that I don't throw in the qualitative data into ChatGPT because the process of analyzing and engaging with the data is my source of learning.
Right.
Even if I look at the Raahi feedback survey that I've done recently, very amenable to throwing it into an AI tool. But for me personally, it was important to read through and try to make sense of it because you know the context of the people who have written it. Right? And that context perhaps is the one thing that is core to the people who are on the field, in the team, and understand it when they look at the data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Poorvaja. Wonderful to have you here for this episode. And I hope that this was a good experience for you as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, you don't often have the patience or the time to, sit back and reflect on all of this at one go. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.